And this is a great turn. Jerry is truly one of those people who needs no introduction. Unless you're new to the community, you know who Jerry Fischer is. But he did give me a little background information about his relationship to Israel, which I think you might find interesting. He's had a very close, intimate relationship with Israel since he was a young child. His uncle came to the US from Kibbutz Sasa to be a shaliach, an emissary, to the train farm for future kibbutz members in Hightstown, New Jersey. Right after high school, Jerry went to Israel on a year course for young leadership, and he was in Israel for the 6-day war. He dug underground garages on Kibbutz Amiad, facing the Golan, and was trained in the use of Checky bolt action rifle and given a perimeter position on the kibbutz in central Israel. After years of graduate academic work in music and anthropology, Jerry became a Jewish communal professional, and he's had a long and successful career, certainly, as we know, many, many years, I think around 30, as executive director of the Federation in Eastern Connecticut. 35, wow, okay. During his tenure here, he established close relationships with the staff of the Israel consulate in New York City and frequently organized VIP tours for the Coast Guard Academy. He also escorted both Congressman Simmons and Congressman Courtney to Israel on official visits. He has written and has had essays published in Hebrew and English for Haaretz and the Israel Times. He still has a large family in Israel and many close friends that he gained from his Federation work, Project Renewal, the Young Emissary Program, and Partnership Together. He continues to lead missions to Israel and will be escorting one this coming March. It's my pleasure to introduce my good friend, Jerry Fischer, for his third appearance at a JETI Talk.
Thank you very much, Carla, and thank you to everyone who's joined us this evening for this conversation. I am not going to run over things with an assumption that you know them, so I'm going to try and to explain just about everything I talk about. However, if you don't understand something that I'm talking about, don't wait till the end of the talk to ask the question. Unmute yourself and immediately say, Jerry, I don't get it, or what do you mean? And then we can move on and everybody will understand. I want to start by explaining how the Israeli election system is fundamentally different from the American system, the British system, and just about every other democracy in the world, save one or two. Israel is a national system of electing members to the Knesset, the Israeli parliament, and these members are not tied to any region in Israel. So in our country, we have congressmen and senators who are tied to small geographic regions or to states. In Israel, there are 120 members of the Knesset. None of them are identified as representing a particular region in Israel. So that's the first very important difference between our system and the Israeli system. Another profound difference is that the Israeli elections are based on proportional representation. What that means is the Knesset has 120 seats. If a party gets 10% of the vote, they will get 12 seats in parliament. If they were miraculously to get 51% of the vote, they could conceivably get 61 seats in the parliament. That brings us to a third and very important historical point, which is that this system worked for a very long time because there was a dominant party, which was called the Labor Party. It was Mapai and Achdut Avodah and other left-wing parties that formed a very clear block of 61 or more votes. There were actually a few years when Mapai, or the Labor Party, on its own had 61 votes. Those days have passed. In the last election, the Labor Party barely passed the threshold, and they only have 4 seats. So you can sort of say how the mighty have fallen or how things have changed so much. The next thing that I want you to understand regarding this proportional representation, non-geographic representation, is that until recently, you only needed 1% to get into parliament. And now, because so many small parties were in parliament, many years ago, or not so many years ago, they raised the threshold to 3.25%, which means in order to sit in the Knesset, your party has to have at least 4 seats. This is important for a number of reasons. The first reason is that it makes exit polling very difficult, and it makes the results very difficult to discern and determine, because the percentage is based on the number of people who vote. And that was a key issue in driving Netanyahu back into power. And I will explain that in a little while. As soon as you don't reach by yourself, by your own party, a majority of 61 seats, you need to form a coalition in order to govern. And the procedure is that the president of Israel invites the heads of all the parties that were elected to the Knesset to consult with him and to suggest or nominate a person who will be designated to form a government and become the prime minister. Now, this is important. It also sadly reveals a problem I'm going to discuss later on in the talk, and that is that one of the Arab parties that was invited by the president to come to speak with him in the presidential residence and recommend someone to form a government refused to make a recommendation. They did not make a recommendation. And the participation of the Arab population in Israel in the elections is a key problem going forward for the state of Israel. So no party gets a clear majority. The parties need 3.25% of the votes to get their 4 seats in the Knesset and be represented. I'm going to ask a question now, and it's not a trick question, and maybe somebody knows the answer, but if you don't, you'll be surprised when I tell you. How many parties do you think ran for the Knesset in the election that was just finished? Take a wild guess.
40.
How many?
40.
It was 39. Very good, Eric. 39 parties ran in the election. Now already you can say that's crazy. And in fact, it is crazy, but it's also either a sign of insanity, because some of these parties have run and run and run over and over and have never made it, or it's a sign of a very vibrant, active political culture. I actually think it's a sign of both. Some of those parties are insane to run, and some of those parties just are so committed to their ideas, even if that idea is the legalization of marijuana, that they will form a party and run to sit in the Knesset. So you all know now, all these political parties know two things: that there will not be a single party that gets 61 seats. So they know there's going to be coalition negotiations. The second thing they know is that they need to get 3.25%. So the question you will ask is, what happens if a party doesn't get 3.25%? And the answer is, all those votes get thrown in the garbage, unless they make a vote sharing agreement with another party. And then that party that only gets enough, a 1% draw, can give that 1% to the other party. And that is different from merging the parties. This is just a vote sharing agreement. By doing that, the votes don't get thrown out. So now we get to begin to analyze what happened in Israel in this last election. When the polls closed, based on exit interviews, exit polling, the prognosticators said it's going to be a 60-60 tie. They didn't realize two things. One, that the Likud had succeeded in getting 200,000 more people to vote in this election than in previous elections. The second thing they didn't realize is that the center-left parties who had failed to make agreements were not going to get into the Knesset. So on the exit polls, Meretz was going to get into the Knesset. Meretz didn't get into the Knesset. Arab parties didn't get into the Knesset. On the center-left side of the political spectrum, the strong ideological and egotistical outlooks of the leaders of the party prevented them from making the deals that would have saved their positions. On the center right, but really more right-wing side of the spectrum, Bibi Netanyahu worked very hard to do two things. He got the religious parties to sign vote sharing agreements, so those votes were not lost. He then did something remarkable and unusual in Israeli politics. And to give you an idea of how remarkable and unusual it is, I'm going to ask you a second question. How many elections, including this last one, has Israel had in the past 3.5 years?
5.
Isha, you're holding up 4. Aaron, you're holding up 5. 5 is the right answer. This was the 5th election in 3.5 years. All right, so keep that in mind. Then realize something else. And here I'm going to talk from my own personal experience in Waterford, Connecticut. If it's proportional representation, and if there are small parties that can act as spoilers, driving the vote for your party can be a key element in winning the election. And the Likud party, and by the way, I want to remind you that the Likud party is a secular, non-religious party. The Likud party put together a voter turnout campaign that was the most effective voter turnout campaign ever carried out in Israel. What did they do? They went with local activists. They identified polling places where at least 24% of the votes in the last election had gone to Likud. They got the names and cell phone numbers of all the voters in that district. And on the day before and the day of the election, they had text messages sent not just to the Likud voters, but to all the voters in that district, telling them to go and vote. And it wasn't an anonymous text. It was from a local activist in the party headquarters in each little city for Likud. So the Likud succeeded in three ways. They got the religious parties, which are to their extreme right, to unify and not lose seats in the Knesset. They got voters to turn out like crazy. And the third way that they succeeded in is they played the social media game in the smartest possible way. And that was to make it personal social media. When they went door to door, they went door to door with local people. When I went door to door in Quaker Hill to turn out votes for the last election for Joe Courtney, I walked with Betsy Ritter, who lives in Quaker Hill. And we walked up and down the streets, and we only knocked on the doors of Democratic voters. I remember saying to Betsy, why don't we vote, knock on it? Oh, they're Republicans. We don't want them to vote. Oh, they're Republicans. We're going to that house. That's a Democrat. We want the Democrats to vote. So while the texting was done on a mass scale, people got text messages on their phone, go vote. The knocking on the door that the Likud organized was done on a targeted, specific way where they only knocked on Likud doors to get the turnout. So what did we have in the end? We had a 64-56 victory for the center right. Now, you have to then ask, and it's why I wanted to have this JETI Talk a month after the election, you have to ask, what does that mean in practical terms? And what it means in practical terms is that Bibi Netanyahu has staged a comeback, and he's hoping with that comeback to avoid the very serious legal issues that he's facing. How does he hope to avoid them? Well, the first way is he'll be the prime minister. And prosecutors, state attorneys, exactly the same thing that we're facing in the states on deciding whether we're going to go after Trump, who's now an official candidate for president, might think twice about prosecuting a sitting prime minister. Second way that he could save his ass by becoming elected is that the right-wing religious parties, and I'm going to address the religious parties in a minute, but the right-wing religious parties are pushing for a reset on how Supreme Court decisions are received. And what is the reset? The reset is that if the Supreme Court of Israel rules that a certain law that the Knesset passes is unconstitutional, in Israel's case, goes against basic laws because Israel doesn't have a constitution, then under this reworking of the Supreme Court system, the Knesset can pass the law again. And if they pass the law again, after the Supreme Court ruled it invalid, it becomes a law. 3, the political decision to prosecute a sitting prime minister is a decision that reflects not only the quality of the evidence, because he already is in trial. He's in the midst of a trial. But it will make the courts think twice, because the one thing that a court does not want to do is to be made to appear impotent. They want their decision to be respected. If Netanyahu is convicted, and by tradition, not by law, he should resign as prime minister, and by law, he should resign if he's convicted of a felony, then he could simply defy the law, confident that his government will protect him. Now, why would the government protect him? The government would protect him because the government is hanging now on the participation of extreme religious nationalist parties. In fact, one party, one man, is a Kahanist. You can honestly call him a fascist. So he's about to form a party, form a government, and the government is going to rely heavily on religious nationalists and rely heavily on positions that are meaningful being given to the members of that party. So that brings us to another aspect of Israeli government that is, in my opinion, really immature. Although we have it in America, we have it very much in America, but it is not quite as blatant. And what is that procedure? Patronage. When the parties argue to join the coalition, you would think that they're arguing on principle. They're not arguing on principle. They're arguing on money. Principle, they already won because they won the election. They have their 4 seats in the Knesset or more, and they're representing 3.25% of the population. So what are they arguing about now? They're arguing about how many ministers will they get in the government? How many sub-ministers will they get in the government? How many highly paid political appointees will they get for their party? And these negotiations are what are so distasteful and abhorrent to me and to most Americans, and to many people around the world, because it is so clearly an economic drive for money. Bibi is not religious. He is not extreme right wing. And he is not someone who you would think would give in to these demands. But he's also in danger of being convicted. And he doesn't want to be convicted. At a minimum, he wants the entire trial postponed. And at a maximum, he would love the Supreme Court to have, excuse my French, its balls cut off so that it cannot force him out of office. So now we come to something very important and something that Reuven Hazan, who actually spoke in our community many, many years ago, and is a very distinguished professor of political science at Hebrew University, has pointed out publicly. And that is that Bibi Netanyahu is probably going to govern not to protect the state of Israel, but to protect himself. He's already made appointments that are frightening and have riled the American Jewish community in ways that you cannot imagine. He's placed someone from the extreme right wing in charge of all extracurricular activities in the public schools of Israel. What those clubs and after-school activities will be are now under the aegis of an extreme religious nationalist person. He's appointed another person in charge of security, including the border police and the police that are operating in the West Bank. The issues that these people will deal with already are well known, and the pushback has not only been international or mostly American Jewry, but it's been local within Israel. So, for instance, even Likud mayors of small cities have declared that their school system will not listen to the guidelines of this right-wing religious fanatic regarding after-school activities. And the mayor of Tel Aviv laid down the gauntlet completely. He said, we're not going to stop our LGBTQ march. We're not going to listen to the guidelines that this man has already promulgated for after-school activities. And many other cities in Israel, including cities run by Likud mayors, have made similar statements. In America, Abe Foxman, who's the retired head of the Anti-Defamation League, made a stunning statement saying, my support of Israel is no longer unconditional. If it turns into a theocracy, I can no longer support Israel. Alan Dershowitz, who went from a very ACLU type left-wing lawyer to a very right-wing lawyer, nevertheless issued a statement saying, if Israel takes the guts out of the Supreme Court of Israel, which he described as one of the best jurisprudence systems in the world and the best Supreme Court in the world, he said it would be a disaster for Israel. So there's pushback happening in Israel against what Netanyahu is trying to do, and in America from very mainstream left-wing Abe Foxman and right-wing Alan Dershowitz people to try and prevent Israel from going fully into a theocratic mode. Now, why?
Jerry, just a question. How do the judges get appointed on the Supreme Court in Israel?
Very similar to here, there's a panel of people who are members of bar associations and other judges, etc. And the way they're selected has been an issue for a long, long time. And that very well might change. And that change is not nearly as dangerous as the change of saying if a law is declared unconstitutional or going against basic laws, then the Supreme Court can vote on it again, and then it's tough tooties to the Knesset can vote on it again, and then it's tough tooties to the Supreme Court. They want to preserve, or Dershowitz wants to preserve, the judicial power of the Supreme Court. Now, what are the issues for Israel? Let's not talk yet about big international things. Supreme Court, which I've been talking about, is a big issue. Halakha is an extremely big issue. There's already a strong push to not recognize conversions to Judaism done outside of Israel by the reform and conservative movements. Right now, the practice, which by the way, is clearly important to me, the practice is if your children were converted in America by a conservative or reform rabbi, we will recognize their Jewishness in Israel. And the Orthodox parties want to throw that out the window. Another key thing that was moving forward, and the Orthodox are going to stop it, is the matter of kashrut certification. Right now, if you use the word kosher in Israel at your restaurant, just the word kosher, it means that you have to close before Shabbos on Friday and open after Shabbos on Saturday night. All of the restaurants have wanted to have a kashrut certification that says all the ingredients we use are kosher, but they don't want to have to close early on Friday night and open very late on Saturday. They just want the authority to say all our ingredients are kosher. A third thing is Shabbat transportation. In Haifa, there's public transportation on Shabbat. In Tel Aviv, there's public transportation on Shabbat. The Orthodox parties want to stop that. The fourth thing, LGBTQ rights.
Jerry,
The minister,
Jerry,
yeah,
how long has the transportation been running in Tel Aviv on Shabbat?
the transportation has been running in Tel Aviv for probably 5 years.
Okay, so that's new. I just want to.
And in Haifa, it's been running for a long time.
Forever. Haifa is
Yeah.
forever. Tel
Forever.
Aviv is new.
Then the new minister who's going to be in charge of LGBTQ stuff has already announced that he will ban the gay pride parade in Jerusalem. You have to remember the gay pride parade was where an Orthodox Jew twice stabbed marchers in that parade. Once killing the woman he stabbed, and another time wounding her very badly. And it was the same guy. He was convicted, let out of jail, and he did it again. The two other really key things, and here, I don't mean to frighten you, but I'm going to frighten you. When people think God is on their side, they think they can do anything. The man who assassinated Yitzhak Rabin came out of Yeshiva and Bar Ilan University. And he clearly thought God was on his side. The settlements are seen by the religious Zionists as fulfilling God's desire to settle the land that God gave us. They don't see the Arabs as legitimate residents of the West Bank. They don't see the Israeli Arabs, many of these parties, as legitimate residents of Israel. One of the parties was advocating to take the whole city of al-Fahim and actually move it to the West Bank to get the Arabs out of Israel. So there's an awful lot of issues that are at stake as this government is being formed. Clearly, Netanyahu is anxious to prove to the world and to most of the Israelis that he's not going to give in completely to these right-wing religious fanatics. So he has kept two of these ministries within the prime minister's office. And he's written into one agreement that any changes on the West Bank must be approved by the prime minister. But remember, he doesn't have Trump in the White House anymore. And the person who spoke to an Israeli, and I'm going to call it because it is, mainstream organization, J Street, was Secretary of State Blinken. And he spoke to the J Street conference Sunday night. And here are some of the phrases he used in his talk. We believe Palestinians and Israelis, like people everywhere, are entitled to the same rights and the same opportunities. One sentence. Another sentence. He spoke about U.S. concerns for equal administration of justice for all citizens of Israel. And then the last thing he said is that perpetrators of violence on the West Bank, whether they're Israeli settlers or Palestinians, must face equal justice. But what does that mean? The first thing it means is that Israeli settlers, and especially the hilltop youth who are manning, quote, illegal outposts, often physically attack Palestinians, pull up their olive trees, harass them when they're trying to harvest their olives, and they never, ever are prosecuted. And under the new administrator of the West Bank, it's very unlikely that they will be prosecuted. What else does it mean? It means that the reasons, the justifications for opening fire on Palestinian demonstrators will now be even greater. So that the orders regarding when to fire will be, if you see a kid holding a stone in his hand, you can shoot him. And clearly the Americans are not happy about that at all. Not only are the Americans not happy about it, but the Israeli military echelon, the elites of the Israeli military, the career officers, are profoundly worried that if these types of actions actually get carried out, that there will be another intifada. There's already been an uptick in terror attacks in the West Bank and to some degree in Israel. And you might remember when the operation took place in Gaza, there were riots in Lod and in Akko of Arab Israelis against Jewish Israelis. So the military is extremely nervous about the people who've been appointed to oversee the border police and to oversee the settlements on the West Bank. And the US is very concerned because the right-wing nationalists are pushing Netanyahu to legalize the illegal outposts. And the final key thing, and those of you that have been to Israel with me will know this, when you drive out of Jerusalem towards the Dead Sea, you drive through a big empty area until you get to Malay Adumim. That area is called E1. And it's in the area that's technically Area C of the West Bank. And it would be the only landline between a possible Palestinian state in the south and in the north. The only land bridge would be through Area E. And there's been pressure for years for the Israeli government to build settlements in Area E. And there's been strong counter pressure, not just from America, but from the EU to not build in Area E, to allow the reality or the possibility of a geographically contiguous state of Palestine. The state of Palestine issue is, forget about it. It's not anywhere in the near future, but preserving the possibility is very.
Jerry, if you're talking about the state of Palestine issue, you've been talking for the last 10 minutes about Palestinian issues and LGBTQ issues and so forth, and all the terrible things that these right-wing nationalists are involved in. To what extent were any of these issues important during the election campaign?
They were very important, but they were only very important to the right-wing parties. They were not important to the Israeli public is concerned about three things and a little bit scared. The first thing they're concerned about is the idea that Israel will always be a, quote, Jewish state. The second thing they're concerned about is security. And that's where the increase in terror attacks really played into the hands of the right wing. And the third thing they're concerned about was, and it's interesting, Netanyahu opened the door. You might remember when Netanyahu tried to form a government last time, he pursued one of the Arab parties to join his government. And he couldn't form a government, but then Lapid formed a government with one of the Arab parties in the government. And a lot of the Israelis ended up being very upset that there was an Arab party in the government. And they voted that way. They voted for Likud and they voted for the nationalist parties because they didn't want an Arab Israeli party in the government. The really sad thing is the Arabs didn't vote. The turnout in the Arab population was much lower this time than in the last election. One Arab party did not get into the Knesset. There used to be 3 Arab parties in the Knesset. Now there'll only be 2. And it's like, my God, what are they doing? They essentially screwed themselves. Just as Meretz and the Labor Party screwed themselves by not combining or not signing a vote sharing agreement. Essentially, nearly 300,000 votes for the center left got thrown out because the parties wouldn't agree to sign a vote sharing agreement. It's 7:16. I'm going to stop now and take questions. And who is R? Who's the picture I'm looking at R in the, it's nobody's face.
That's
Oh,
Ramona.
okay. Thank you. Got it.
Jerry, it seems like the Arab parties have the potential of being kingmakers, and they're just cutting up their nose to spite their face. When considering their population, they could actually have a major say in how the governments are formed.
Yes, they could, but I think they're poisoned now. I mean, Jewish Israelis are not going to want Arab parties in the government, and they won't vote for parties that say we're going to put Arab parties in the government. They just won't do it. It's a tragedy right now. Somebody else, please. You have 10 minutes left before you have to daven.
Jerry, does that go for leftist Israelis as well?
No,
They don't-
no. But it does go for center Israelis. It goes for, Benny Gantz's party. It's and Lapid succeeded in some ways that nobody thought he would. The whole government before this government was essentially an anybody but Bibi Netanyahu government. Yesh Atid and the National Unity Party. I mean, their strength was we don't want Netanyahu to run a government, and they didn't run a good campaign. We could really out-organize them in a very basic, really democratic grassroots way. We could turn out the voters, and the Arabs didn't turn out the voters, and Benny Gantz and Lapid didn't turn out the voters. So they lost. And Meretz and Labor just decided not to get married, not even to be friends. They didn't sign a vote sharing agreement. I mean, they talked about merging. Then they said, oh, we're not going to merge. But then they didn't sign a vote sharing agreement. The whole dynamic would have been different if A, there had been vote sharing agreements between Meretz and Labor. If B, Yair Lapid had recognized the desires and anxieties of a Jewish state and spoken to those anxieties. And if the Arabs had shown, which they could have shown, that yes, our participation in the government actually helped our communities. And it did. But it was just a really stupid campaign run by the center-left parties.
Jerry,
Mike,
yeah. Is this an ongoing trial now against Netanyahu? Is that proceeding on a daily
Yes.
basis?
well,
Do
not
we have
daily,
any
but yeah, it is.
Do we
Now,
have
you
any
have to
idea?
understand, it's not a jury trial in Israel. There are no jury trials in Israel. So
Oh.
this is a panel of judges interrogating the lawyers from both sides. And
Will Netanyahu, will he testify in this trial?
they didn't want to call him to testify.
Is
He
there any
could.
idea? Is
He
there any idea when this trial could conclude possibly, or what?
I would say within the next 6 months.
I see. Thank you.
So I'm still trying to figure out why young people didn't really support the left of center secular candidates and so on. I know that some people say it's because you can't underestimate how many of those young people happen to be Haredi, and they would tend to vote with Shas or with United Torah. So, but is it because maybe some of them had gone through the military and became a little bit more right of center, conservative? I don't know. What's your thought, Jerry?
My thought, I have two thoughts on that. One thought is the frontline soldiers in Israel, after an Israeli soldier killed a Palestinian terrorist who had been wounded and was lying on the ground, and then he shot him in the head, and then he was tried and convicted. A lot of Israeli soldiers did not like that at all. They did not like that at all. So they don't want to vote for somebody who would support the judicial actions that the army took to discipline this soldier. A second point, which is very difficult to for me to accept, is the idea that they are Jewish nationalists. They want it to be a Jewish state, quote unquote, and they saw Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid as making it more of a pluralistic state. And they're if you're even slightly orthodox, you're not that interested in pluralism. You're interested in tradition and in feeling very comfortable being in your city and having everything shut off on Friday night and not opening till Saturday night. And they want that. They don't. Now, there's a whole lot of Israelis who will run to Tel Aviv or run to Haifa or will really run to the old city in Jerusalem to do their shopping on Saturday. I mean, you have no idea. You think it's the tourists that are in the old city of Jerusalem on Saturday? It's the secular Israelis from Jerusalem who want to go shopping, and they go to the old city.
Jerry?
Yeah.
Could it, the fact that there was less Israeli Arab participation this time around signify that they're disaffected, they lost hope, and maybe are identifying more with their Palestinian brethren in hopes of
They are disaffected, but they're disaffected in a way that we don't normally think about. They're disaffected in that the two parties that did not join the previous government were the secular parties. And the party that Benny Gantz and Yair Lapid brought into their government was the Islamist party. I mean, you have to realize that just as there are religious Jewish parties, there are religious Arab parties. And it was the religious Arab party that went into the previous government. And one of the Arab parties is essentially the Communist Party, Balad. And no, there's still this residue of strong ideological allegiances. They messed up Meretz, they messed up the Labor Party, and they messed up the two secular Arab parties. They're ideologically pure, and now they're impotent, as Robert Levin said. They could be very powerful, but they're impotent. As I pointed out, one of them, Balad, was summoned to the president's residence and did not make a recommendation. He didn't even pick Yair Lapid. I mean, he could have said, I don't recommend Netanyahu, I recommend Yair Lapid. He recommended nobody. It was a very depressing declaration of we're done with this. It's very sad.
Jerry, I absolutely hate to interrupt you, but
No problem.
I wanted to have a moment to say thank you, and also Carla can certainly chime in, but also I understand you're leaving soon for Israel, so safe trip. No,
Well, I'm leaving Thursday for Germany.
Germany. Okay, I knew you were going
I'm
somewhere.
making a movie about Henny Simon, and I'm going back to Berlin and Hanover, where, by the way, Hanover is where I celebrated Rosh Hashanah. It was beautiful.
I
But
wanted to
I'm
say
leaving for
safe
Germany.
travel.
March is the trip to Israel. If any
Okay.
of you haven't gone with me to Israel, come in March. Ask Carly.
don't- Yeah, don't miss it. It's fantastic. Jerry, it was a fabulous talk, very clear. I'm sure you explained Israeli politics to a lot of us who didn't really understand it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you. And please,
Thank you,
please,
Donna.
please log back on if you can for Minion at 7:30. Take care and have a good week. Take care.
Shalom, shalom.
Shalom. Bye-bye. Thank you,
Shalom.
Jerry. Safe travels.
Screen.
That's good.
Oh, it's great. 28. Are you kidding?